All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Big Douglas Show. As always, we're going to get into the Commanders today. It is my privilege to welcome back to the show Craig Hoffman from the Team 980. Craig, how are you?
I'm good, man. Privilege feels strong, but I'm happy to be here.
The intros are, I get these things wrong all the time. The intros are the worst.
No, I
Hey,
appreciate it. I will say my favorite intro story ever. I introduced Roger Bennett from Men in Blazers for any soccer fans out there. And Roger is British. And I buttered him up, and I thought he was going to just end the interview right there because his Britishness was so uncomfortable with being complimented that he was basically done. I might as well have not have done the interview. He recovered, and the interview was good. But at least I don't have that going.
yeah, it's the one thing that I feel the worst is the intros and making sure that I get them right. And I've done, I don't know, hundreds of these things, and it I don't know, it never gets easier. But at any rate, here we are. Um, let's see. Before we get into the Commanders, you had Tommy Shepard on the other day.
Mhm.
How do you feel about the way they've constructed this thing? I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter whether you're in or out on Beal. They've made the decision to run this thing through Beal. I mean, I guess they have outs, but what did you get from him, and do you agree with the strategy that they've taken?
Well, it's a tough question because it's not really like the big structural issues with this team are not Tommy's fault. There are things that he said about the decisions that he's made that I disagree with in terms of how successful or not they've been drafting, for instance. Um, it's better than a lot of people think, worse than he wants to admit. But what's he gonna do? Come on the radio and be like, "Yeah, I did a terrible job." So I get it. The way I would describe it is this, Doug. Tommy operates in a very small box. The box has a very high floor and a very low ceiling, and those both come from the fact that they've invested what they have in Bradley Beal. Bradley is a good enough basketball player, by the way, especially when flanked with Porzingis and Kuzma, that you're not going to be terrible. And you kind of got to be terrible to get one of these top picks in the NBA or obviously win a very low percentage proposition in the lottery. Unfortunately, those same players also cap you at a certain level. To be a 50-win team, to be a 55-win team, to be a high 50s competitive for a championship team, you need one of the best 7 players in the league, best 5 players in the league, depending on the depth of the league at any given time. That number probably sits around 6 or 7 right now. And they not only don't have that, and this is my gripe with them, which again is part Tommy, but really done by Ted, is they don't have a path to get there. And like this year, if you trade Kuzma, you trade Porzingis, you tell Brad, like, hey man, you've been battling some injuries. We're gonna be really strategic with your minutes, and you get into the higher parts of the lottery by losing a bunch of games in the draft with 2 A+ level prospects in Scoot Henderson and Victor Wembanyama. Now you've got a path. Instead, their path is to continue to run it back and hope that they're good enough with a big three of Porzingis, Kuzma, and Beal. That's not good enough to win a championship. And that to me just, it's because Ted doesn't want to tank. And I get it for business reasons, but I actually think it's bad for business overall. Like short-term business reasons, sure, it puts fans in the seats and gives you a chance to make the playoffs. Then that playoff revenue is serious. But you're also killing your fan base out of apathy. And I just don't think that's a wise decision.
Well, I was going to ask. I mean, I haven't been in the area for 5 or 6 years now. However, my understanding is they're not packing the stadium,
No.
the arena anyway. So this idea, right, that we don't want to tank because I don't want my profit margins to dip. At the same time, doesn't feel like that's actually what's happening, right?
Right, no. And like I get what they're saying too. Like when Tommy's like, "Well, we think when those three are on the floor together, we can be pretty good." And like he's correct. When those three are on the floor, even 2 or 3 of them have been on the floor this year. You dive into the nerdy, lineup based data, like, how per 100 possessions, what's their net rating. That's not even that deep into it. There's all kinds of numbers that suggest, yeah, when they have those guys out there, like they're better than most teams. But there's also a realistic element that Porzingis has battled injuries his whole career. Beal's battled injuries much of his career, and especially lately. And, at 28, it's not like Kuzma's 22 and emerging, averaging 22 a game. He's 28 in doing this. And so how much better is he going to get? And so when you already are not packing the stands, you don't really have star power. You don't really have a path to getting it. Like, what's the point? And if you're not in it to win championships, then I think that's pretty upsetting to a lot of fans. And that's obviously something we could talk about with the Commanders as well, right? Is like, if you're not in it, if you're in it just to make the playoffs, okay. And then the question is how patient. And that was the thing that really stuck out to me from the interview that I thought was really frustrating from Shepard, was he kept preaching patience. Okay, for how long? You haven't been good since at least 2017. You haven't been over 500 in 5 years. What are we patient building? What? A mediocre team? Like that to me just falls flat. And it's kind of the same thing with Rivera and Washington. It's like, yeah, they're okay. They're not the worst team in the league, and their roster is actually kind of nice in some places. But how are you going to get to that next level? And that's where I don't see it for any of the teams currently in DC.
Let's use it as a pivot. I believe that I read an article that you wrote saying that you thought Rivera was the right man for the job when they hired him.
Mm-hmm.
If I read the article right, and I'm pretty sure that was yours, do you still believe it now?
Yeah, I certainly remember saying that at the time, writing it at the time. I think there is something to that, because I think it's important to remember the scandalous state that the franchise was in, and that is before all the Washington Post stuff came out, right? Like Bruce Allen and Jay Gruden and that whole regime was it was such an unsteady ship. There was a lot of holes. And I think they needed the credibility and kind of the professionalism that Ron did bring to the organization. I think in getting to watch him the last couple of years, I think some of that stuff might have been overstated. Not that Ron is unprofessional by any means, and certainly not in the ways that are going to wind up in a Washington Post article, the way that Bruce and whoever else that worked there that's name wound up in the articles was. So you don't have to worry about that, but that's a pretty low bar. I do think that there is I think the press has been harder to manage for Ron than he imagined. And I don't know with hindsight if he was really ready for this market. Charlotte, there's good reporters down there. Like Jordan Roderick, who now works out in LA, was down there when Ron was there. She's a fantastic storyteller and can be a dogged reporter when she's onto something. Joe Person is a really good reporter who's still the Carolina beat reporter for The Athletic. And there's some folks that have worked for the Charlotte Observer over the years that are also very good and have gone on to do even bigger and better things. With all that said, he's struggled at times, and he's had some self-created controversies. And I do also think the way that, we talked about this last time I was on, like the way he has handled some of the stuff around the Post reporting and the congressional stuff has really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know how many coaches would have done better, if I'm being honest. That's just kind of is a nature of the beast. So in a lot of ways, I do think that he was the right coach at the right time to steady the ship. I don't know if he was quite as good as I maybe thought at the time, having seen some of the warts up close. And I definitely don't think he's the right guy to take you from where they are now to the next level. Like I'll often say, there's A to B coaches and B to C coaches, and C stands for championship. Ron, I think, was a good A to B coach, because I don't even know if they were an A in some ways. But is he the one that's going to elevate this group to the next level? That I have serious doubts about.
If you could convince Ron to take president of football ops job, which he has, and just keep it and put in a new head coach, do you think Ron has now become a better front office man than he is a head football coach?
That's an interesting question. And it also touches on something about his coaching style that I think gets kind of twisted. People will criticize him because he won't say go to the Senior Bowl, and it's supposed to be coach-centric. And I think there's a big difference between coach-centric and coach-do-everything. Ron, in some ways, is already there. You hear complaints, too, that, what does he do? Does he actually even coach the team? It's no, he just gets up in front of the room sometimes and then just, occasionally yells at practice. And it's okay, the coach-centric, what does he do? What Ron does is very front office-y. He hires people and empowers them to do their job. And then if they don't do their job, he'll eventually, later than all of us want him to, move on from that person. And so in some ways, he already does that while still keeping the I'm in the front of the room, I'm doing the press conferences, like the public facing side of a head coaching job, and then obviously some of the top line responsibilities of organizing. And that's some things that some GMs do. That it just depends on the organization. Like, because you have the title of general manager doesn't mean that you do a set of responsibilities. Every club has the same set of responsibilities. How they divide them depends on your skill set. If your GM is a former player turned scout who's the cap stuff is like they understand it enough to do the job, but it's not their specialty. I need that team to hire a cap guy. If their GM is a cap guru, but has never scouted in his life, but came up through the statistical analytical side of an organization and really understands the cap and how to manipulate it and how to create windows, but he's like, hey, I need strong scouts to be able to tell me who those players are, then I need that GM to hire a really strong director of personnel, college and pro. So with Ron, like he takes on some of the super high level stuff already. And the question would be if he were to move into like that front office role, right? What does the head coach do? They could be more hands-on with their side of the ball. They could be doing more involved in the scouting process. They could be involved in any number of things. So his responsibilities, they would change, obviously, some, but in a lot of ways, that's kind of how he runs the team now. He runs it in a very chief executive kind of role. He just does it while head coaching and president of football operations Inc.
The difference, I guess, is that Ron's weaknesses, to me, are what are supposed to make a head coach really good.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like the in-game decisions.
That's true. Yeah, that's a pretty big one.
These things are not his
Right.
strong suits. But what I think I have realized over the last couple of years is he is really good at being that chief CEO. Like, I don't think we realized that he empowered the coordinators to do quite so much as what they've done. I think he's more hands-off with those guys. We can argue that he waited too long with Scott Turner.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fair. And again, maybe one of his faults. But to me, that's why I want him in the organization. I just don't want him as the head coach because I think those things that make a head coach really good, he lacks in.
Yeah, well, one thing I would say too is for political reasons, if he's not the head coach anymore, like I think he should just go. Like if the former head coach is looming, that's a tough gig for the new head coach, especially when that guy's your boss. I guess it's worked in like Boston with the Celtics with Brad Stevens. But Brad was like ready to be done coaching. I don't know that Ron is ready to be done coaching. I think also interestingly enough, Doug, for the in-game stuff, you're correct that he's not been good at it, but he also hired a guy for that. Like there's someone in his ear be like, take time out. And like that stuff that, if you have to, there's a time element to that. So if you need that extra step of someone telling you, that's not always the greatest if you have someone who can do that stuff. Although it is pretty common to have a coach because you're focused on so many things, especially if you're a play caller, which Ron is not. Like if I was a play caller, I'd want someone doing that. It's like, well, if that's your only real responsibility, then why are you yanking the quarterback in the middle of a game against whoever it was when he yanked Heineke out for Wentz against San Francisco? Then why do you need an extra guy for that? So what actually are you doing in a game besides standing there with your arms folded, looking kind of angry? So there is that element. Yeah. So I hear you. I do think he's good at like the personnel management. I do think there's some leadership characteristics that are positive. I actually don't I think to kind of counter what you said though, I don't think you'll disagree with this, just kind of adding more color to the conversation. I think he's actually bad at the quality control sometimes. I thought it was pretty ridiculous that he would get up after a game or especially late in the season and was like, well, we're trying to do this. Or like in the postseason press conference, Scott did what he wanted to do. That quote is damning of Scott. It's also damning of you. You're the head coach. You are not me. I get on the radio for 3 hours a day and opine and have zero say over what happens. It drives me nuts. And sometimes in like YouTube comments, for me and Logan especially, you guys are causing this. We don't cause anything. Trust me, if we had control, things would be done differently. I have squadoosh control over what happens with the Washington Commanders. Ron Rivera does. He's the head coach with all the power. So why are you getting up opining about how you wish you ran the ball more? Get on the headset during the game and tell your offensive coordinator that that's what you want. You're the head coach. And so I think the empowerment is a double-edged sword. He has trust in the people that he hires. That is good. He allows them to do their jobs. That is really, really good and rare in a lot of bosses, forget in football, but in life. A lot of people want to micromanage. But you still do have to, as a boss, manage people and keep them within the rails of what your vision is. And I don't think he was particularly good at that offensively, certainly last year, and with a mixed bag over the previous two.
All right, we've waited long enough. Let's get to the news of the day. I haven't seen anything pop up yet, but obviously we're on Eric Bieniemy watch. I think I had been told a long time ago that it's kind of what this was going to go. It's interesting, and maybe this is because the league already knew this was kind of a done deal. Still odd to me that nobody even reached out to Bieniemy for an offensive coordinator gig. Maybe the Colts did. But that's I'm still trying to figure out this Eric Bieniemy stuff. Do you have a bead on what's going on here? Because I get maybe why he's not getting a lot of head coaching looks. I don't necessarily agree with some of those,
Right.
but I understand kind of what people are trying to say. But it's odd that he's not even getting offensive coordinator looks.
I got nothing for you. If I told you in an offensive league that the offensive coordinator of two of the last four Super Bowl champions, three of the last four Super Bowl participants, and by the way, in that one other year that remains unaccounted for by the Super Bowls, he lost in the AFC Championship game in an offensive heavy league, that guy's not a head coach, you would call me an idiot, and I would tell you, I'm sorry, that is the truth. That is Eric Bieniemy. That is insane. That is his track record the last 4 years in an offensive obsessed league, and he cannot get a head coaching job. By resume alone, that is preposterous. And then you get into Andy Reid is responsible for a lot. I'm like, that didn't seem to hurt Matt Nagy.
Sure.
It didn't seem to hurt Doug Peterson. And those
Or
guys,
from McVay's tree, right? Because McVay called all the plays.
Sure, it didn't hurt Kevin. It didn't hurt Zach Taylor. And three of the four guys I just mentioned turned out to be pretty good head coaches, at least so far. Small sample size. Taylor, all he's done is make the AFC Championship game a bunch. Kevin had a really good year, especially offensively. Obviously, they got to figure out some things defensively and fell flat in the playoffs, but he still won, 12 games? And you talk about the situational stuff. They were masterful in situations this year, which is why they won so many games. And that was a point of emphasis. Obviously, Sean had a little bit of that. He called plays for 1 year here. Jay was the primary play caller, and they kind of still split those duties. It was a very collaborative process in the same way that it is collaborative in Kansas City. And then obviously Peterson's been a successful head coach in two places, and he was previously under Andy Reid. So, if it doesn't match up with all the other folks who have had similar experiences, there does seem to be one glaring one that seems to be an issue here, and that is the lack of diversity candidates around the NFL for the top positions. That seems to be the difference. And I hear the same stuff as everyone else that, he doesn't interview well or stuff like that. I talked to Mike Jones about that of The Athletic, and Mike's like, yeah, I've had lots of conversations with Eric over the years about personnel, about scheme, and I don't know, it doesn't add up to me because he seems as sharp as anybody I've ever talked to on these things. He's highly organized. He knows a lot about leadership and has a philosophy, like a defined philosophy. So when you start to talk to people that are closer to Bieniemy and have had these kinds of conversations with him over the years, it just doesn't add up other than he doesn't fit the mold and the profile of what owners are looking for. That said, if we look at what this means for Washington, coup for us, coup for the Commanders. They're getting a guy who, yes, he has not been a solo play caller, and he will have more autonomy here than he has ever had in his life. He does have a running backs background, both in his career, and then that is obviously what he started at as a coach, even though he has been an OC for a long time at this point with Andy. But the run game and that side of things, where he was incredibly successful as a running backs coach, by the way, Adrian Peterson's best seasons were with EB as his running backs coach. And there's always concern, I think more concern with the running backs coach going into an OC role than a quarterbacks coach in terms of the passing game, the sequencing, all those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, like this dude's resume is ridiculous. And to be in the room, even if Andy was doing a lot, like he's learning, he's in the room with Andy Reid in every single meeting. You know, he clearly has a relationship with Patrick Mahomes, although the special relationship seems to be between Mahomes and Reid. Like there's still a pretty special one between Bieniemy and Mahomes. And so he's built relationships with the quarterback. And I don't get why he's available, but for Washington, like coup for the Commanders, because they get one of the best guys over the last half decade. And unless it was a total facade, which seems like an absurd thing to be true, they got way better at offensive coordinator.
Incredibly better. And you're right. I mean, it feels like the diversity equation to this is all that's left, because other than interviewing poorly, which I don't buy into.
But even that, Doug, not to cut you off, but just like to specify what that means is like, if you come from a different generation, a different background, whatever, even a different part of the country, like let's say a guy who grew up in New York City is the owner and he's interviewing someone who grew up in the deep South, like the accent might throw them off. And is that, that guy's not a head coach, he sounds dumb to me. Like that's a non-racial stereotype that comes up in all walks of life all the time. So it's not just like a race thing necessarily in terms of, when we talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias, like those are the kinds of things that can come up. With Bieniemy, when you look what he looks like, for him, it is obviously racial. What he looks like versus what Cliff Kingsbury looks like, what Sean McVay looks like, what Shane Steichen looks like, what Jonathan Gannon, who's even a defensive guy, but like fits the young, good-looking white guy mold. Like I think a lot of these older white owners see themselves in these coaches, and they're like, that's what I look like when I was younger. That's what I want. And Bieniemy, the jolly big black guy, doesn't fit that mold. And no matter what's coming out of his mouth, it doesn't matter. He didn't interview well the second he showed up looking like Eric Bieniemy, and that's crap.
And lastly on that, on reasons as to why, the other one is we hear a lot about incidences he had 23, 24 years ago. Is that fair?
That's a tougher one. And that is especially in the modern environment, which is good that we're more sensitive to these things, I think is relevant. And if you're going to put yourself under the scrutiny of this guy's now my head coach, is that something you want? But I would also say then teams should step up and say it. If that's the reason, and be like, yeah, sure, there's some things that are disqualifying from his past that we're just not interested in having someone who's done these things as our head coach. It's a long time ago. I would hope that he's rehabilitated and he's looked hard at those types of things, that he's changed and is a better man today. I don't think that people should permanently go to shame island, but I also think that there is certainly rehab and remorse that needs to be shown depending on what obviously any transgression, just the levels matter based off the level of the transgression. Yep. And so for someone like Bieniemy, he's in an interesting spot, because I do think that a lot of people are pulling for him, but then they might learn about some things in his past and be like, whoa, wait a second. But I don't think, to be clear, I don't think that's the reason he's not getting the job. And the NFL has shown that they will take talent over a rap sheet, or not necessarily a criminal rap sheet, but a transgression committed in someone's past time and time and time and time and time again. If they think that they will help the team win, they will do that, which is why I don't get this whole thing. Is like, what's your deal with him? All he's done is win everywhere he's ever been, and no matter every position he's ever been in. So why all of a sudden is you think he wouldn't be good in whatever position? And to your point, it's not like other assistants of Andy Reid's haven't gotten hired.
Right. They keep making this be an Andy Reid thing, but Matt Nagy got a job, and by all accounts, they're pumped to get Matt Nagy back into that offensive coordinator position as soon as Bieniemy's gone. So it's odd to me. The whole thing is really weird. It's hard to put my finger on. And I only brought it up just because like I said, my brother had texted me this morning and was like, I get all this stuff, but not even one other offensive coordinator interview anywhere. I mean, I guess Baltimore was going to, until they hired the offensive coordinator from Georgia. So it's just odd that not even to get one other, unless the league just already knew it was a foregone conclusion that he was coming here.
Yeah, and I guess that's possible. And a lot of teams also were working on an expedited timeline. They weren't willing to have the patience that Rivera had. And I think part of that probably for Ron is he has had Pat Shurmur in his back pocket the whole time. And Shurmur also didn't interview anywhere else. Like a lot of these candidates that interviewed in Washington weren't interviewing other places. They weren't in on the top candidates because of the ownership stuff and a litany of other potential reasons. And so their list was different than everyone else's. At that point, what's the rush? Like you don't have to be in a rush to hire someone because you're afraid they're going to go somewhere else. And so they could wait on Bieniemy until after the Super Bowl. Other teams must have felt a greater urgency. And if it's like, hey, we really want the hot candidate, then we got to move now. We can't tell that guy to wait so we can interview Eric Bieniemy after the Super Bowl. We got to move on him now, otherwise the team down the road is gonna hire him.
Taking away Ron's 2-to-1 convo about Ron, because I think we all know at this point that wasn't exactly what he meant.
Yeah.
If that is the point, though, if they do want to emphasize defense and running the ball, are we overlooking the idea that Greg Roman? I think people forget his track record. I mean, number one rush offenses, not just with running quarterbacks out in San Francisco and then again with Lamar, but with Tyrod Buffalo, they had the number one rush defense offense 2 years in a row. Are we getting too excited about Bieniemy and missing Greg Roman? Do you have a preference of the two?
My preference is ever so slightly Bieniemy. I think that he can bring a lot of really good run concepts to this team as well. Like he's obviously got the rushing background, plus he's got the pass game background of working with Andy these last couple of years. I think the screen game has been horribly underutilized here. I think that is something that Reed is considered the master at. And if Bieniemy can bring 95% of what Reed knows about the screen game to Washington, like hallelujah, let's go. I think a player like Curtis Samuel benefits tremendously from Bieniemy, where he's proven he can do stuff with like a Tyreek Hill, a Kadarius Toney. Like he knows how to use speed, and that is what this team has at the skill position. So I think Bieniemy is the right fit. However, to your point, if you told me that we need an offensive coordinator to implement a run system to complement a very good defense under a defensive head coach, and that OC needs to understand kind of his place within the larger football team, there is almost no one, not just available now, but in the history of the league, certainly the recent history of the league, who is better suited for that than Greg Roman. All he did was work with Jim Harbaugh and that crew in San Francisco, which was one of the best defenses of the last 2 decades in the league, to get them to a Super Bowl, by the way, with a young, inexperienced quarterback who was incredibly physically gifted, but had some limitations as he was adapting to the NFL. A young man by the name of Colin Kaepernick, who, like Sam Howell, had a howitzer of an arm, is a good runner. Cap is a way better runner than Howell is, but like has the mobility, and was able to implement an offense that maximized his skills, minimized his weaknesses, and ultimately helped them win a ton of football games. Similar concept in Buffalo with Rex Ryan. Obviously, Harbaugh is a former quarterback, so he's an offensive coach. They worked in some level of collaboration. But under a defensive head coach in Buffalo, he had great success with Tyrod Taylor and a very limited group of weapons up there, but had one of the best years that Shady McCoy had outside of his super peak in Philly. And then in Baltimore, obviously we know what he did with Lamar and that running game and very little at wide receiver. And I think the thing that gets twisted is people are terrified that he would underutilize or misuse the wide receivers here. He's never had wide receivers.
That's right.
He's never, ever remotely had anyone close to Terry McLaurin. And you could argue not even Curtis Samuel or Jahan Dotson. The best receivers he's ever had are Michael Crabtree, who was pretty good in San Francisco, but he's not the level McLaurin was. And Sammy Watkins had one good year in Buffalo. Baltimore's had nobody. Maybe Devin Duvernay last year, maybe.
Yeah.
Like
Bateman, but he got hurt early.
Right, and is not that good. So, all he's done is accentuate strengths, minimize weaknesses, and been a part of winning football teams. That sounds like a good guy to hire. So yeah, if all of a sudden for some reason the salary, the control, whatever doesn't work out with Bieniemy, run to hire Roman as fast as you can. And honestly, Doug, I try to hire both of them. I try to give Roman a senior assistant or whatever position he wants on this staff. And if those two are willing to work together and their egos aren't going to get in the way, and not just their egos, but their philosophies and what they would want to do, if they could collaborate, shoot, bring them both in.
I was going to bring that up next. I think it would be a great idea. Before we wrap up, how much leeway, how much control do you think he'll end up getting? I mean, we're talking about an interview process that's now going into day 2. I would assume a lot of that has to do more with staffing than it does with, play calling. They know what EB system is going to look like. I don't think they need to know a ton about that. Ron's, I'm sure, talked to Andy about EB. So in my mind, if you're going into day 2, probably more about staffing types. We know how crazy this offseason is going to be. What kind of, ability do you think he'll have to put together his staff?
Yeah, I think that is certainly the ongoing conversation. And the longer the interview goes, like, what are you talking about at this point? Well, I want this, I want that. Like that, those conversations have happened. Or like, what's your philosophy? Okay, those conversations have happened. There's only so long that those conversations can take up space. At some point, you're like, all right, we just got to figure out the contract, but we're committed to doing that. We also need to be able to figure out what this staff looks like. Who do you want to bring? This is who we have. This is who's under contract. This is who is not under contract, but I would be open to bringing them back if you do. Like, to me, those are the kinds of conversations that can happen so they can move quickly. Are they in a bad spot timing wise? No. Are they a little bit behind a lot of other teams? Yes. And so they want to be able to catch up on the coaching carousel as fast as they can, get Bieniemy in place, decide if they keep Zampese. Does a guy like Roman get a role, or anybody else that they interviewed from the outside that doesn't currently have a job? Does a guy like Shermer come in? Does Bieniemy say, like, yeah, I want Pat as my QB coach? Or do they want that senior offensive assistant position that like Jim Caldwell just took in Carolina? What do they want to actually have here? And I think those conversations are probably happening right now, as well as figuring out the contract. I have zero doubt that Ron will give Bieniemy not carte blanche on the hiring process. Ron's going to certainly be involved in that. But in terms of philosophy and certainly a heavy say, I think Bieniemy, like, that's part of him coming here. Like, that needs to be a part of the story, that Ron is empowering him and that Bieniemy gets it, because that's part of the reason you get Bieniemy. He wants to be seen as powerful. Yeah.
For example, not to cut you off, but like Matsko is not Ron's guy. The offensive line was not good last year. And I think part of that is because they just assumed Matsko would coach a problem. And it wasn't as simple as that. Like, I wonder, does a guy like Eric Bieniemy have the opportunity to replace a guy like that, who we all know Ron has a big history with?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I just don't know the answer. Sure. And obviously neither is anybody else but those two guys in that room right now. But like, here's what I would ask Ron. If the difference in you getting Bieniemy and not is John Matsko, who are you picking? Like, I would pick Bieniemy. Right. Unless like you think that Matsko and Roman wants to keep Matsko, like, you can get into those conversations. But at the end of the day, like, do you want Bieniemy or not? Okay, you do. Well, you're going to have to take him on his terms. And so at that point, everyone's up for discussion. I think it's worth a discussion. It's not like Bieniemy should come in and, like, if he's coming in and being like, yeah, that Matsko guy sucks. Like, your offensive line was terrible last year, having barely watched them and not knowing what's going on in practice and all those kinds of things. I think that's pretty silly. But I think that's probably the ongoing discussions. And I would say this too, like, on this and some other issues, ownership chief among them, Bieniemy's interviewing Rivera as much as Rivera is interviewing Bieniemy. So, like, Eric is trying to figure out, is this the job I want? Because he knows once he leaves the Andy Reid nest, he is hoping he is one step from a head coaching job. Is this the step? Or is this a black hole that he's about to step into and, this is actually going to hurt his career? So he's got to make sure this is the right move for him as well. And I think those are probably part of back and forth discussions as much as, like, Bieniemy being like, oh, I want that guy, and Ron standing up for him. He's, how those discussions play out could determine whether or not he ultimately takes the job.
I know you got to run. Let's wrap with this one here. If Eric Bieniemy does the things he's brought in to do, in your mind, is there a way that they can all stay together with new ownership? Or more likely than not, new ownership comes in and already has a plan. Like we already heard Sean Payton say, he had been reached out
Mhm.
to by potential. So, is there anything that this group, because if Eric Bieniemy gets this into, let's just say, a top 15 offense, and you got a top 10 defense, you very well could be looking at 10 or 11 wins next year. I mean, I know we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, but in your mind, can this group salvage the season, put together a winner, and all keep their jobs?
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, what can they do? They can win. And I
Right?
don't think it's unreasonable. Like, it depends a lot just based on how good Sam Howell is. Like, if
It
Sam
right.
Howell is a solid starter and he can distribute the ball to these playmakers, if they can do the things they need to do on the offensive line and shore that up, which will obviously help Howell tremendously, and they can play defense at the level they did last year, or maybe even better with some continuity and some added depth, like, this team could easily win 10 games next year. Like, that's the weird thing. We kill Rivera about all kinds of things. And sometimes I think we go overboard, especially on the roster. This roster is not bad. It's not
That's a good roster.
great. It's not great, but
Nope.
it's pretty darn good. And it is great in some places. And so if they can figure out how to maximize that greatness, the D line, the wide receivers, etc., they could be good. Now, is 11 wins and losing in the first round of the playoffs enough under new ownership? I think it depends on how it goes down and it depends on the kind of impression Rivera makes. But 12 wins, win a playoff game, like, it's really hard to move on from that. I think the other side of that coin, though, Doug, is like, I think there's a chance that Rivera gets gone because, a power struggle ensues. He's like, oh, we won 11 games. We're doing great. What do you mean you want to hire an executive vice president of football operations that is over my head, which a new owner's probably going to want to do? And Rivera winds up leaving, and the new person comes in, and new owner comes in, and either hires a head coach who wants to keep the enemy or hires the enemy. So I don't think that if I'm EB, I'm looking at this as like, hey, if Ron gets blown out, I'm definitely gone. I think if I'm him, I'm looking at it as I do a good job. I'm going to be a head coach next year here or somewhere else, and the here is certainly on the table.
No doubt. Who's coming up on the radio show today?
I'm really excited. Chris Naki is co-hosting with us from 4:30 on. It's his first time doing that. I love having Chris on the phone before Maryland games, and obviously Maryland had a huge win last night. He actually was at Colorado with Eric, I believe, back in the day, so got some good inside perspective on EB, the buff from back in the day, and some NBA topics with him. About to talk to Danny Parkins as well from our sister station in Chicago, exploring the Justin Fields space. So the Bears actually going to trade him. So we got a bunch of good stuff. Clinton Yates always is on Fridays as well. So we got Nikki Javala is on at 4 o'clock. So we got a pretty stacked show, Doug.
Busy show. Busy show. Clinton's my guy. Tell myself what's up.
I will.
All right. Thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
Sounds good. Always good to chat.
All right, man.